She had spent 9 years protecting a secret she thought was buried forever. Then an 8-year-old girl ran across a ballroom full of 500 people, wrapped her arms around a janitor, and called him daddy. The music stopped. Every head turned, and Amelia Ashcroft, one of the most powerful women in America, felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. Some secrets don't stay hidden, some men don't stay gone, and some children know the truth long before anyone is ready to hear it. If this story already has your heart racing, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Because every week we bring you stories that will shake you, move you, and remind you what it means to be human. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't you dare leave before the ending. Let's begin. The Hartwell Grand Ballroom had been dressed to impress people who were already impossible to impress. 12-foot floral arrangements of white orchids and dark calla lilies climbed the walls on either side of the entrance, their stems threaded through iron latticework that had been imported from a workshop in Tuscany. The chandeliers, 3 of them, each the size of a small car, threw warm gold light across a crowd of 500 guests who had paid no less than $20,000 a plate to attend the Ashcroft Foundation's annual charity gala. The cause was children's literacy. The real business, as always, was something else entirely. Deals sealed over champagne, alliances formed in whispered conversations near the bar, reputations either built or quietly demolished before the dessert course arrived. It was the kind of event where everyone performed a version of themselves they'd spent years perfecting. Mason Ryder was pushing a mop bucket. He moved along the far edge of the ballroom near the service corridor entrance, keeping close to the wall the way people do when they've spent years learning to disappear in plain sight. His uniform was standard: gray trousers, a white button-down shirt with the hotel's crest on the left breast, rubber-soled shoes that didn't squeak on marble. He was 32, broad through the shoulders in a way that the loose uniform mostly hid, with calloused hands and a jaw that carried a fading bruise from where his son Caleb had accidentally headbutted him 3 days ago while they were wrestling on the living room floor. He'd told Caleb it was the greatest wound he'd ever suffered. Caleb, who was 7 and already developing his father's dry humor, had said, "Good. Now we're even for the flu shot." Mason almost smiled at the memory. Almost. He kept his eyes moving the way he always did in crowded rooms. Not obviously, not like a man scanning for threats, just a steady, quiet awareness. Old habit. The kind you don't shake no matter how many years pass or how far you walk from the life that built it. He'd been working nights at the Hartwell Grand for 11 months. The pay was decent, the manager left him alone as long as the work got done, and the hours fit around Caleb's school schedule. He picked Caleb up every morning at 7:30 when the overnight shift ended, dropped him at school by 8, slept until 2, was back at the school gate by 3. That was the entire architecture of his life right now, and he had built it deliberately, brick by brick, because the alternative, chaos, instability, the kind of uncertainty that made a 7-year-old boy wake up scared in the night, was something Mason refused to tolerate. He had enough ghosts of his own. Caleb didn't need to inherit them. The ballroom was filling toward capacity now. Mason had been working the perimeter for about an hour, handling a situation near the east wall where a server had dropped an entire tray of sparkling water, 16 glasses, a spectacular cascade. And the cleanup had been more involved than expected. He'd done it quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention, which was exactly how he preferred every aspect of his employment here. Then he saw her. Not Amelia Ashcroft. He'd seen her earlier in the evening, from a distance, the way you see someone on a stage. The hostess, the face of the foundation, the woman whose photograph appeared on business covers and whose name was attached to 3 of the buildings in this city. 30 years old and already the kind of powerful that made older men nervous. She'd arrived in a midnight blue dress that cost more than Mason made in 4 months. And she'd worked the room with the practiced ease of someone who had learned long ago that charisma was just another tool. No. The one he noticed first was the girl. She was small for 8, with dark hair pulled into a braid that was already coming slightly undone, the kind of braid a child fidgets with. And she was wearing a navy dress with white trim that matched her mother's color scheme in that deliberate, coordinated way that publicists arranged for photo opportunities. She had a security detail, 2 men in earpieces who maintained a respectful 10-foot radius, close enough to react, but far enough to pretend they weren't there. The girl, Sophie, he would learn her name later, though he didn't know it yet, was standing near the base of the grand staircase, watching the adults with the particular expression of a child who is simultaneously bored and overwhelmed. Her gaze moved around the room without settling, the way a bird hops from branch to branch, without committing to any of them. Then her eyes found Mason. He noticed because eyes always found him eventually in rooms like this. Usually out of mild curiosity, the slight double take of someone wondering why a maintenance worker was lingering near the event space instead of the service corridor. He'd learned to meet those glances neutrally and move on. But this was different. The girl went completely still. Not the stillness of recognition in a normal sense, not the way a child spots a parent across a grocery store. Something more complicated moved across her face. Something tentative and enormous at the same time, like a person standing at the edge of something they've wanted for a very long time and are suddenly terrified to reach for. Mason looked away, kept moving. He was rounding the corner near the staircase's base when he heard the change in the room's ambient noise. Not loud, just a subtle shift in the crowd's murmur, the way water sounds different when something disturbs its surface. He turned his head slightly. The girl was running, not toward her mother, not toward her security detail, both of whom were already moving, hands raised, faces tightening in that controlled alarm that trained professionals wear when something goes off script. She was running toward Mason. He had about 3 seconds to process this before she reached him. She collided with his legs, both arms wrapped around him, her face pressed against his hip, and she held on with the total commitment of a child who has decided something and cannot be argued out of it. The nearest string quartet, they were midway through something that had been background noise for the past 40 minutes, simply stopped. Not at a natural break, just stopped. Bow lifted from string, the last note hanging in the air, and then gone. In the silence that followed, 500 people turned to look. The girl's voice was muffled against Mason's uniform, but completely audible in the sudden quiet of that enormous room. "Daddy." Mason did not move. He stood very still with the mop handle in one hand and a child he had never met in his life clinging to him, and every instinct he had ever developed, in training, in combat, in the years of careful, quiet rebuilding that had followed, told him that whatever he did in the next 10 seconds was going to matter enormously. He looked down at her. Up close he could see her face now. She tilted her head back to look at him, and her eyes were dark, nearly black, and wet at the corners with the effort of holding something in. Her lower lip trembled once, and then steadied. She looked at him the way people look at something they've been carrying for a long time and are finally willing to put down. "I know it's you," she said quietly. "Just for him. I just know." Mason crouched slowly, bringing himself to her level. His knee hit the marble and he felt the cold of it through his trousers. He looked at her face carefully, the way he used to look at maps, studying the geography, the landmarks, trying to find his position. "Hey," he said. His voice came out steady. He was grateful for that. "What's your name?" "Sophie." She wiped her eye with the back of her hand. "What's yours?" "Mason." She nodded as if he'd confirmed something. "I dreamed about you," she said. "My mom says dreams aren't real, but I knew you were." He didn't have an answer for that. He didn't think she needed one. The security detail reached them in the next moment. 2 large men with the careful, deliberately non-aggressive body language of professionals who have been trained to manage situations without escalating them. One of them said, gently but firmly, "Sophie, sweetheart, we need to go find your mom." Sophie looked at the man. Then she looked back at Mason. "Will you stay?" she asked. "I work here," Mason said, which was not a promise and not a refusal, the most honest answer he had. Sophie's grip on his arm loosened slowly, reluctantly, the way a fist opens when the thing being held is let go of by choice rather than force. She stepped back, allowed the security man to rest a hand on her shoulder and guide her away. Mason straightened, stood, picked up his mop handle from where it had leaned against the staircase post. He did not look at the crowd. He knew they were staring. He knew the murmur was starting again, rippling outward through the room like a wave finding its way to every corner. He kept his eyes forward, kept his breathing even, and walked at a normal pace back toward the service corridors. He made it approximately 40 feet before someone stepped into his path. The woman was shorter than he'd expected, given the way a room contracted around her. Without the elevated stage and the distance and the crowd between them, Amelia Ashcroft was just a person. 30 years old, dark-haired, her face a careful composition of things she'd spent years learning to control. Right now, that composition was under pressure. He could see it in the tightness around her eyes, the slight elevation of her chin that wasn't quite confidence. She'd walked quickly across the ballroom, which meant she'd abandoned multiple conversations, which meant she wasn't thinking straight, which meant she was scared. "Service corridor," she said, her voice low. Not a question. Mason looked at her for a moment. "I need to finish my—" "Please." The word came out different from the rest, less constructed. 5 minutes. He held her gaze. Then he nodded and changed direction toward the corridor door. The service corridor smelled like industrial cleaning solution and the distant warmth of commercial kitchens. Fluorescent lighting, concrete floor, the sound of the ballroom reduced to a muffled thrum on the other side of the wall. A cart of clean linen sat against one side. A stack of folding chairs leaned against the other. Amelia paced 3 steps one direction and 3 steps back. Then she stopped and looked at him. "She has never done that," she said. "In 8 years. Sophie has never... She doesn't run to strangers. She barely goes to people she knows." "I understand that's alarming," Mason said. "Who are you?" It was barely a question. Her voice had the precision of someone used to gathering information. "Mason Ryder. Overnight maintenance. I've been on staff here since last January." "That's not what I'm asking." He looked at her. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, the quartet had resumed playing. A different piece now, something slower, as if even the musicians understood the mood of the room had shifted. "She called you..." Amelia stopped, swallowed, started again. "Sophie has never met her father. She doesn't know what he looks like. She's been asking me since she was 4, and I've told her..." Another stop. The composition on her face was cracking slightly at the edges. "I've told her that he was someone I knew a long time ago, and that circumstances..." "How old is she?" Mason said. 8. She'll be 9 in March." Something moved through Mason's chest, quick and cold, like a door opening onto winter air. He let the number sit for a moment. Did the math he didn't want to do but couldn't stop himself from doing. "Her father," he said carefully. "Do you know who he is?" Amelia's eyes sharpened. The vulnerability retreated, replaced by something harder and more familiar. "I think you need to tell me where you were 9 years ago," she said, "because I am looking at something right now that doesn't make sense to me, and I don't like things that don't make sense." "Where were you 9 years ago?" Mason asked. She blinked, hadn't expected the redirect. "A conference," she said slowly. "A tech investment summit in Annapolis. I was 21. I just closed my first serious funding round." A pause. "I met someone there. One night. There was a situation at the hotel. An emergency. He..." She pressed her lips together. "He wasn't there in the morning. And 2 weeks later, I found out I was trying to track down a man whose ID turned out to be classified, and every contact I had hit a wall, and eventually I accepted that I was going to do this alone." Mason was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent light above him buzzed very faintly. He'd never noticed it before. He noticed it now. "Annapolis," he said. "Yes." "September." Her face changed. "How do you know that?" He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. Not a nervous gesture, just a man buying himself a second to figure out what words come next when the words feel too large for a service corridor at 11:30 at night. "I was there for 12 hours, he said. I was in transit. There was a situation at the hotel. A credible threat against one of the attendees, someone my team had been flagged to monitor. We contained it." He met her eyes. "I wasn't supposed to be seen. I wasn't supposed to talk to anyone. But there was a fire alarm in the East Wing, and I helped evacuate a floor, and there was a woman in room 412 who..." He stopped. Amelia had gone very still. The color had shifted slightly in her face. "Room 412, she said. "Yes." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You were military," she said finally. "Navy, special operations. And you just disappeared." There was no accusation in it, or she was working hard to keep the accusation out of it. Just a statement, flat and old, something that had been said in her head thousands of times and had finally found its way to air. I was recalled before morning, Mason said. There was no way to leave a name or a number. The operation I was pulled into was, he exhaled, classified as an understatement. I was off the grid for 14 months. By the time I surfaced, I didn't have a way to find you. I didn't know your last name. I only knew the hotel, the city, the room. You could have tried. I did try. His voice was quiet, but it had a floor to it, something solid underneath. I tried for 2 years. I hit walls too. Amelia looked at him for a long time. Her eyes moved across his face with the careful, unsentimental attention of someone who has been lied to before and has developed ways of checking. She has your eyes, she said finally. Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, just different, the way a room sounds different when the last window closes. Mason didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. He drove home at 2 in the morning with the windows down despite the October cold, needing the air, needing the noise of the city to fill the space inside the car because the silence was too loud. Caleb was with his neighbor, Mrs. Fenwick, an arrangement they had 3 nights a week. Caleb loved Mrs. Fenwick because she let him stay up until 9:30 watching nature documentaries, and Mason was grateful to her with the specific gratitude of a man who has learned to rely on small kindnesses and take nothing for granted. He sat in the parking lot of his apartment complex for a long time before going inside. 8 years old. She would be 9 in March. He had a son, and he had loved being a father with everything he had. The sleeplessness, the terror, the specific hilarity of raising a small person who had opinions about everything and no filter whatsoever. He had built his entire life around Caleb, had made every decision, taken every job, sacrificed every ambition, all of it oriented around one small boy who trusted him completely. And somewhere in that same city, a girl with dark eyes had been growing up without him. Not because of anything anyone chose, not because of cruelty or carelessness or cowardice, just because the world is sometimes brutal in the most impersonal way possible, because sometimes things happen and the math doesn't add up until 9 years later in a service corridor under a buzzing fluorescent light. He sat there until 3 a.m. Then he went inside, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and stared at the wall for a while. He thought about her face, the way she'd looked up at him. I just know. He pressed his palms against his eyes and held them there. Then he took a breath, got up, and started making coffee. Because tomorrow Caleb needed breakfast, and life didn't pause for the things that split you open. That much he'd always known. The coffee he made at 3 in the morning sat on the counter and went cold. Mason stood at the kitchen window of his apartment, 3rd floor, east-facing, a view of the parking lot and beyond it a stretch of chain-link fence, and then the back wall of a dry-cleaning business, and watched the sky do the slow, reluctant thing it did every morning before sunrise. The dark didn't lift all at once. It just got thinner, degree by degree, until the shapes of things came back. He'd been a father for 7 years. He'd done it alone, or mostly alone. His sister Deb in Portland sent money when she had it and called every Sunday, and Mrs. Fenwick next door had become something between a neighbor and a lifeline. But the daily weight of it, the 10,000 small decisions that made up a child's life, those had been his. He knew how to be a father. He'd had years of practice at the specific art of holding someone else's fear so they didn't have to carry it. What he didn't know was how to be the father of a child he'd only just learned existed. Those were different skills. He wasn't sure he had them. He also wasn't sure what Amelia Ashcroft expected him to do with what she'd told him. They had exchanged phone numbers in the corridor, her personal line, not an assistant's, which he noted. And she'd said, in the careful, clipped way of someone managing a situation they haven't fully processed yet, that they would talk more. Soon. When she'd had time to think. He'd said okay. What else was there to say? He picked up the coffee, poured it down the sink, and made a fresh pot. Caleb came home at 7:15, still wearing his pajama pants under his jacket, because Mrs. Fenwick had apparently determined that pants were optional on Friday mornings when there was no school. He walked through the door eating a piece of toast and immediately said, without preamble, Mrs. Fenwick says otters hold hands when they sleep so they don't float away from each other. That's true, Mason said. Is it? Or did she make it up? It's true. Sea otters. They call it rafting. Caleb considered this with the serious expression he brought to all new information. He was 7, with Mason's coloring and his mother's, Elena's, bright, restless eyes, and he had a way of going completely still when he was thinking that Mason found both familiar and a little unnerving, because it was exactly what Mason did himself. "We should do that," Caleb said finally. "Hold hands while we sleep? So we don't float away." Mason looked at his son for a moment, felt something shift in his chest, that particular wordless thing that hit him sometimes without warning when Caleb said something that cracked him open a little. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Caleb climbed onto a kitchen stool and started on the second half of his toast, and Mason poured 2 glasses of orange juice and set one in front of him. And for a little while the morning was just the morning. The refrigerator hum, the sound of traffic picking up outside, the easy silence that lived between people who know each other well enough not to fill every gap. Mason thought about Sophie. He thought about her the way you press on a bruise, not to hurt yourself, just to check that it's real. Amelia called at noon on Saturday. Mason was in the parking lot of a grocery store, sitting in his truck with the engine running for heat, waiting for Caleb, who had gone in with a list and $8 and the specific confidence of a child who has been trusted with a task. Through the store's glass front, he could see the back of Caleb's head moving along the cereal aisle. He answered on the second ring. "I need to see you," Amelia said. No greeting. "Not at the hotel. Somewhere, I don't know, neutral." "There's a coffee place on Delaney Street," Mason said. "Mercer's. It's quiet in the afternoons." A pause. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled, the breath of someone who had been managing herself all morning. 2:00, she said. "I'll be there." She hung up. Mason watched Caleb emerge from the cereal aisle holding a box of something that was definitely not on the list, look at it, put it back, look at it again, and put it in the cart anyway. A small, private negotiation. Mason smiled despite himself. Mercer's was the kind of coffee shop that had been in the same location for 22 years and looked exactly like it. Wood paneling, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu that hadn't fundamentally changed since the early 2000s. It smelled like dark roast and the particular warm, dusty smell of old upholstered furniture. The afternoon crowd was thin. A college student in the corner with headphones and a textbook, 2 older women sharing a slice of cake near the window. Mason was already there when Amelia arrived, 6 minutes past 2. She came through the door in jeans and a plain gray coat, hair down, no visible security, or none that were obvious, though he noted a man in a dark jacket who sat 2 tables away and ordered a coffee he didn't drink. She sat down across from Mason without taking her coat off. "You have someone on the door," he said. She looked at him. "You noticed that fast." He hasn't touched his coffee, and he sat facing the entrance. Amelia's expression did something complicated. "My head of security insisted, after what happened at the gala, She stopped. "It doesn't matter. I didn't come here to talk about security protocols." "I know." The waitress came. They both ordered coffee without looking at the menu. When she'd gone, Amelia put her hands flat on the table, not threateningly, just a gesture of organizing herself, and looked at him. "I had someone run a preliminary background check," she said. "Mason Ryder, former United States Navy, Special Warfare, attached to DevGru, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, for 4 years before a medical separation 8 years ago." She paused. "The specifics of your separation are sealed." "Yes," he said. "There's a son, Caleb Allen Ryder, age 7. Mother deceased." Her voice was careful on that last word. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," Mason said. He meant it, but he said it the way you say things that are true but don't need elaboration. "The Annapolis conference," Amelia said. "I've been thinking about it all night. I remember there was an incident, a fire alarm, controlled evacuation, they said. We were told it was a malfunction." She searched his face. "It wasn't." "No." "Was there a real threat?" "Yes." "It was managed. No one was hurt." He looked at her steadily. "You were safe." Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. More like the disorientation of having a piece of history rearranged without warning. "You were supposed to stay invisible," she said. "Yes." "But you didn't." "No." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. A woman on the fourth floor was in the stairwell alone, and she was trying to get down, but the smoke was heavier on that landing, and she was scared, and I He stopped. I wasn't supposed to be seen. I know that. I stayed longer than I should have. Amelia looked at him for a long time. You stayed long enough, she said quietly. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, a city bus went past, and the window vibrated faintly with it. Sophie's been asking about her father since she was 4 years old, Amelia said. Her voice had changed register. Less boardroom, more something underneath it, something that had been there before all the success and the power and the practiced composure. The first time she asked me if he was dead, I said no. She asked if he was a bad person. I said no, absolutely not. She asked why he wasn't with us, and She exhaled. I told her it was complicated, that sometimes adults lose each other in ways that aren't anyone's fault. She accepted that for about a year and then started asking again. She accepts and then starts again. Every time I think we've reached a resting point, she starts again. What does she know about that night? Mason asked. Nothing. Only that I met someone once, and she came from that, and that's all I've ever told her. She wrapped her own hands around her mug. She's perceptive, frighteningly perceptive for 8. She understands more than I want her to sometimes. How is she? After the gala? Quiet. She hasn't brought it up directly, but Sophie goes quiet when she's processing something big. She'll come to me when she's ready. Amelia paused. She asked me one question that night, when I got her to bed. She asked if the man from the party was someone I knew. What did you say? I said I was still figuring that out. Amelia met his eyes. I'm still figuring that out. Mason nodded. He understood the honesty in it, the way she'd answered a question about the past with the truth of the present. He respected that. It was harder than it sounded. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know. It came out plainly, without the usual careful packaging. I know what my lawyers would say. I know what my PR team would say. I know what my board would say. She paused. I'm not asking any of them. What about Sophie? Sophie is 8. Sophie already made a decision, Mason said, in a ballroom full of 500 people. Amelia looked at him. Her jaw tightened fractionally. That's not... She doesn't understand what she did. She understood exactly what she did. He said it without heat, without pressure. Just a thing he believed. She's been looking for something for a long time. She found it. 8-year-olds don't have the same talent for talking themselves out of what they know. Amelia was quiet for a moment. You sound like you've spent a lot of time with an 8-year-old, she said. 7-year-old. Close enough. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to one. A small thaw in a long winter. What's he like? Your son. Mason thought about it. Not the automatic parental answer. Oh, he's wonderful. He's my whole world. But the real one. Stubborn, he said. Incredibly stubborn. Gets that from both sides, which is unfortunate. He's funny. Not on purpose, which is the best kind of funny. He's obsessed with animals right now. Any animal. He'll tell you 17 facts about a species you didn't ask about, and then look at you like you're welcome. He paused. He's had a hard couple of years. Lost his mom when he was 5. He doesn't talk about it much anymore, but you can see it. There's a place in him that's careful, more careful than a 7-year-old should have to be. Amelia listened without interrupting. He noticed that about her. She didn't rush to fill silences. He sounds like someone who needed a steady father, she said. He needed more than that. But I'm what he's got, so we make it work. She looked at him. Not the evaluating look from the corridor, but something more direct, less strategic. I want to propose something, she said, and I want you to hear it without assuming I'm trying to control it. Go ahead. Let Sophie spend time with you, supervised at first. I'll be there, or someone I trust. We don't tell her the full truth yet, because she's 8, and the full truth is... She searched for the word enormous. We let her get to know you as a person first. We give this time before we give it language. She paused. If at any point it becomes harmful to her, we stop. Her well-being is not negotiable. Mason looked at her. And my son? Amelia blinked. She hadn't expected the question, or maybe she had and it still caught her. What about him? If I'm building something with Sophie, Caleb's part of my life. He's not negotiable either. He wasn't saying it aggressively, just marking a line clearly. I'm not asking you to include him immediately, but at some point, they're going to have to know about each other. Amelia absorbed this. He could see her recalibrating, working through the implications, the variables, the complications, and he waited while she did it. One thing at a time, she said finally. One thing at a time, he agreed. She nodded, extended her hand across the table, a gesture that was half professional habit and half something more deliberate. He shook it. The first meeting between Mason and Sophie was at the Ashcroft Foundation's community garden, a stretch of raised beds and gravel paths on the south side of the city that the foundation funded and that Amelia visited regularly enough that Sophie's presence there drew no attention. Amelia had arranged it for a Wednesday afternoon, telling Sophie only that they were going to check on the winter planting. Mason was already there when they arrived, crouched near one of the beds, looking at a tray of seedlings with the focused attention of someone who has never done this before but is taking it seriously, which was accurate. He'd looked up winter gardening the night before and consumed about 4 hours of information he didn't need and couldn't stop reading. Sophie saw him before he saw her. He heard the pause in her footsteps, a small sound, a hesitation, and then she walked toward him with the deliberate carefulness of a child who has decided to be brave. "You're the man from the party," she said. He looked up. "Yeah, I'm Mason." "I know." She crouched beside him, examining the seedlings with the same seriousness he'd been giving them. "These are garlic," she said. "They go in the ground now, so they grow in spring. The cold makes them stronger." She looked at him. "Miss Reyes told me that. She runs the garden." "That's smart," Mason said. "Cold makes a lot of things stronger," Sophie said. "That's what Ms. Reyes says. She's been through a lot, so she knows." He looked at her. She was looking at the garlic, her small hands resting on her knees, her braid in slightly better shape today, but still drifting loose near the bottom. She had the quality of a person who is saying two things at once and trusts you to hear both of them. "You holding up okay after the gala?" he asked. "That was a lot of people staring." Sophie shrugged with one shoulder. "I'm used to people staring at my mom. It was different when they were staring at me." A pause. "I wasn't scared, though. Were you?" "A little," he said honestly. She looked at him then. Something flickered in her face, approval or relief, or something between them. "That's okay," she said. "Being a little scared is fine." They planted garlic for an hour. Amelia sat on a bench 10 feet away with her phone, and Mason could feel her watching without watching, the practiced peripheral awareness of a mother tracking her child's emotional weather. Sophie asked him questions with the relentless, redirecting efficiency of someone running a very thorough interview. What kind of work did he do? Did he like it? Where did he grow up? Did he have any pets? What was his favorite animal? Did he know how long octopuses lived? Did he know they could open jars? "I did know that," Mason said. "Most adults don't," Sophie said, with the mild disappointment of someone who has given this information to many adults and found them all equally unprepared. "I have a son who's into animals," Mason said. It was the first time he'd mentioned Caleb. He kept his voice neutral. "He's 7. He's been telling me octopus facts for about 6 months." Sophie looked at him with sudden interest. "What's his name?" "Caleb." "Is he nice?" "Mostly. He has his moments." Sophie considered this. "I don't have any siblings," she said. "My mom says it's just the two of us, and that's a complete family." She paused. "I think it is. I just wonder sometimes what it would be like." Mason looked at the row of garlic starts they'd placed in the dark soil. He didn't say anything. I didn't think he was supposed to, not yet. But he felt the weight of the moment, the proximity of a truth that was waiting, patient as the garlic, for the right season. The weeks that followed had a quiet, provisional shape to them. Mason and Sophie met twice more at the garden, then once at a small natural history museum that Sophie requested with the air of someone who has been wanting to visit for a while and has finally found the right person to go with. Amelia was present each time, nearby, available, watchful. She and Mason developed the uneasy rhythm of two adults navigating shared territory without a map. They were careful with each other, professionally courteous. The history between them, the enormous, improbable history, sat in the room without being discussed directly. Like furniture, neither of them wanted to move yet. But things weren't staying quiet everywhere else. Mason first noticed it as a feeling, the mild, persistent sense of being watched that had nothing to do with Sophie's security detail or Amelia's careful observation. He started noticing the same car in different locations. A photographer outside his apartment complex, not unusual in this city, except that the lens was pointed at the building rather than anything above the street. A call from a number he didn't recognize that went to voicemail and left 10 seconds of background noise and then disconnected. He'd lived in the world of intelligence long enough to know the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. This was pattern recognition. He said nothing to Amelia for 2 weeks. He didn't want to alarm her over something he couldn't yet quantify, and he was still learning how to read her. How much she wanted to be protected from uncertainty versus how much she wanted the straight truth. The answer turned out to be what he should have expected from a woman who had built a company from nothing. She wanted the straight truth. He told her on a Thursday afternoon, standing outside the museum after Sophie had been collected by her security detail and driven home. They stood on the sidewalk, city noise all around them, and he laid it out plainly. The car, the photographer, the call. Amelia listened without expression. Then she said, "My board has been asking questions about you." "Which questions?" "Who you are, your history, why you're suddenly in proximity to my daughter." Her voice was careful, but there was something tight under it. "There are 3 members of my board who have been looking for reasons to challenge my leadership for about 18 months. I've managed them. But this, a man no one knows, with a sealed military file, suddenly connected to Sophie. This is the kind of thing they'd use." "Use how?" "I have a morality clause in my charter that's deliberately vague. They could argue that any undisclosed personal relationship represents a breach of transparency." She paused. "They'd be wrong, but they'd make enough noise to cause damage." Mason looked at her. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to know how serious they are." She met his eyes. "I also want to know if there's anything in your past that they could actually use. Not speculation, fact." He held her gaze without flinching. "There's one incident," he said. "The mission that ended my career. The details are classified and will stay classified, but the fact of it exists in sealed records. Someone with enough resources and the right contacts might be able to find the file exists without being able to open it." "What happened?" "An operation went wrong," he said. "Civilians were put at risk. Our intelligence was compromised. People under my command were hurt." He said it flatly, not to minimize it, but because there was no other way to say it that wasn't performance. "I made a decision in the field that contradicted my orders. It was the right decision. I'd make it again. The brass didn't see it that way, and I didn't fight them on it, because fighting them would have meant opening everything up publicly, and I wasn't willing to do that to the families of the men who were there." Amelia watched him. "You took the fall," she said. "I took responsibility. That's different." She was quiet for a moment. A cab went past, horn brief and impatient. "I believe you," she said. The words were simple. She said them like they cost something, which he understood. She was not a woman who gave that sentence away easily. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It doesn't solve the board problem." "No," he agreed, "but it means we solve it together instead of separately." She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not the soft thing, not yet, but the beginning of the recognition that the person standing next to you might be, against all probability, someone you can stand next to. "Together," she said. Not warmly, but she said it. It was Caleb who broke the careful choreography, the way children always eventually break the things adults try to arrange. Mason had been scrupulous about keeping his 2 worlds separate. Caleb didn't know about Sophie. Sophie didn't know about Caleb beyond the brief mention at the garden. He told himself this was protection, which it partially was, and convenience, which it also was, and maybe also the fear that bringing these 2 pieces of his life into contact with each other would make everything more real than he was ready for. But Caleb had come to the hotel once, an emergency, Mrs. Fenwick with a minor health scare that turned out to be nothing serious. Mason needed to collect him mid-shift. And Caleb had been in the lobby for approximately 4 minutes before Sophie's security rotation brought her through on the way to a foundation event. Sophie stopped dead. Caleb looked at her. "Your hair is coming out," Caleb said, pointing at her braid. Sophie reached up and touched it. "It always does that." My dad used to try to braid mine, Caleb said. He was bad at it. Now I just don't have long hair. Sophie looked at Mason, then back at Caleb, then at Mason again. Mason could feel the moment expanding around him, getting larger and heavier, demanding a decision he hadn't made yet. This is Caleb, he said to Sophie. My son. Sophie looked at Caleb with an expression that was ancient for an 8-year-old, curious and cautious and hungry for something she wasn't sure she was allowed to want. I'm Sophie, she said. Cool, said Caleb. Then, because he was 7 and had no governor on his mouth, do you know anything about octopuses? Sophie blinked. I know they can open jars. Caleb's face lit up with the pure, uncomplicated delight of someone who has just met their intellectual equal in a specific and important subject area. Okay, he said. You're good. Sophie looked at him for another moment. Then something happened in her face that Mason had only seen once before, when she'd reached for him in that ballroom, before the fear had caught up to the certainty. The same thing. The same leap. She smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile of a child raised in public life, surrounded by cameras and adult attention and the constant awareness of how she appeared. This was the other kind, the unguarded, slightly lopsided one that happened before she could stop it. I know a lot more than that, she said. Caleb nodded sagely. Same. They stood there in the lobby of the Hartwell Grand, 2 children who had each grown up without a complete family, who had each developed the particular careful armor that comes from knowing something is missing without being able to name it, looking at each other with the specific, mutual recognition of 2 people who are going to matter to each other before any adult in the room has worked out how to let it happen. Mason looked at Amelia, who had come through the lobby door just in time to see all of it. She was watching the children. Her expression was something he didn't have a word for yet, overwhelmed and terrified, and something else, something that was not quite happiness, but was pointed directly at it. She glanced at Mason. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing useful to say. The children were already moving on, Caleb beginning a detailed explanation of bioluminescence in deep-sea octopuses. Sophie listening with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly in the way she had when she was paying very close attention. The gap between 2 separate lives had just gotten measurably smaller, without anyone's permission, without any plan, the way the things that matter most usually happen. Mason reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. He thought about garlic, about cold making things stronger, about an 8-year-old girl who had told him that in a winter garden, like it was the most natural wisdom in the world. He was beginning to think she might be right. The board moved faster than Amelia expected. She found out on a Monday morning, 7 weeks after the gala, when her general counsel called at 6:45 and used the phrase emergency governance review in a tone that meant it was neither an emergency nor a review, but something that had been planned for longer than anyone was admitting. 3 senior board members, Harlan Voss, Patricia Drummond, and a man named Jeffrey Chu, who had been angling for a seat at the executive table since before Amelia turned 25, had filed a formal inquiry into what they were calling undisclosed personal entanglements that may constitute material risk to the Foundation's public standing. They had photographs. The garden. The museum. Mason and Sophie crouched over a tray of garlic seedlings, Sophie's head tilted toward him in that particular way she had, the way that anyone who looked at it for more than 2 seconds would recognize as something other than casual. Amelia sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold for the 2nd time that morning and read the inquiry document twice. Then she called Mason. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been awake. They filed this morning, she said. I know. I have a contact who monitors certain kinds of legal filings. A pause. How bad? Bad enough that they want a full board session by end of week. She turned the document face down on the table so she didn't have to look at it. They're framing it as a transparency concern. What they actually want is a lever. To do what? Remove me from day-to-day operational control. Install an interim executive committee. Her voice was steady. She'd been practicing steady since the call at 6:45. They've been building toward this for 18 months. You're not the cause, Mason. You're the occasion. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the ambient sounds of his morning, a cabinet closing, water running, the distant voice of Caleb asking something from another room. What do you need from me? He asked. Nothing yet. I need to talk to my lawyers today and figure out the legal exposure. but I want you to know what's happening. I appreciate that. Another pause. Amelia, whatever they have on me, the sealed file, the Annapolis conference, any of it, I want you to know that I'm not going to disappear on you to make this easier. If that was going to be my move, I'd have made it already. She held the phone for a moment without speaking. I know, she said finally. She hung up and sat in her kitchen for a while, watching the light change on the wall. The thing about the board session was that it happened on the same week as the Ashcroft Foundation's annual corporate celebration, a dinner event that had been planned for 8 months, a gathering of major donors, partner companies, and industry leaders at the Hartwell Grand's second grand ballroom. Canceling it was not an option. Postponing would signal crisis. So the board session was scheduled for Friday morning and the celebration for Friday evening, and Amelia spent the intervening days moving between lawyers and event planners with the composure of someone who has learned that falling apart is a luxury she cannot afford on a schedule. She handled the board session the way she handled most things that tried to undo her, directly, precisely, and with the particular cold clarity that her opponents always underestimated because it was wrapped in a 30-year-old woman's face. She arrived with documentation that her general counsel had assembled in 72 hours, a full accounting of her interactions with Mason, the timeline, the professional nature of their current arrangement, and a single, carefully worded paragraph about Sophie's welfare that she had written herself and that said, in the language of corporate governance, exactly what she intended, that her daughter's relationship with a family member was a private matter, that no foundation assets had been misused, and that any attempt to leverage a child's personal life for board politics would be met with the full legal force she could bring to bear. Harlan Voss pushed back. He was 64, had been on the board since Amelia was 23, and had a manner of speaking that made everything sound like reasonable concern while meaning something else entirely. We're not questioning your personal life, Amelia, he said. We're questioning the judgment of introducing an unknown individual into your daughter's life, and by extension into the Foundation's public sphere without appropriate vetting. Mr. Voss, Amelia said, the appropriate vetting is my determination, not the board's. Sophie is my daughter, not a Foundation asset. When your daughter's photograph appears in connection with the Foundation's events, she was at a garden maintained by Foundation funds because she enjoys gardening. If the board intends to regulate where my 8-year-old spends her Wednesday afternoons, I'd encourage you to read Section 12 of the Governance Charter, which is very clear about the boundary between operational oversight and executive personal conduct. She paused. I've read it. I'd recommend you do the same before Friday's filing becomes a legal liability. Jeffrey Chu said, carefully, we're only trying to protect. I know what you're trying to do, Amelia said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And I want to be equally clear about what I'm going to do if this inquiry proceeds without legitimate cause. I will make the full record of this session available to every major donor in our network, along with a detailed account of the governance history that preceded it. She looked around the table. We're done for today. She walked out before anyone could respond. In the elevator, she pressed the button for the lobby, stood very straight, and let her hands shake for exactly the time it took to reach the ground floor. Then she straightened them and walked out into the city. By Friday evening, she was holding it together on momentum and very little else. The celebration dinner had the formal architecture of these events. Round tables with white linens, a dais at the front where remarks would be made, the pre-dinner cocktail hour where the real conversations happened, and the dinner itself where they continued, 530 guests. The same Hartwell Grand Ballroom, reconfigured, the same chandeliers, different flowers. Amelia moved through it the way she'd been trained to move through everything, present, engaged, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments, never letting the surface show what was underneath. Mason was not working that night. He'd taken the evening off at Amelia's request, not because she was trying to hide him, but because she thought he deserved one night that wasn't about managing someone else's perception of him. Sophie was there, in the care of her security detail, and a Foundation staff member she trusted named Rosa, who had been with the family for 4 years and who Sophie addressed as Rosa and treated with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has always been a reliable fixture. Sophie sat at a table near the side wall with Rosa, drinking sparkling water and eating the dinner roll she'd decided was the best part of formal dinners, watching the room with those dark, observant eyes. The mercenaries came in at 8:47. They came in as catering staff, 6 of them, through the kitchen corridor, timing coordinated with a shift change that had been manipulated from inside, which Mason would piece together later, along with the fact that the operation had been planned for at least 3 weeks and almost certainly had a connection to the same people who'd been feeding information to the board. The connection ran through a shell company linked to a competitor who had been trying to acquire Ashcroft Foundation's proprietary data platform for 18 months. All of that would come later. In the moment, there was only the sudden and absolute reorganization of the room from celebration to something else. It happened fast. The first indication was the sound from the kitchen corridor, not loud, controlled, the kind of professional efficiency that doesn't announce itself. Then the doors to the ballroom opened, and 6 men in catering uniforms walked in, and 2 of them were holding weapons that were not concealed. The room had a half-second of confused silence, the specific collective delay of 500 people processing something that shouldn't be happening. And then the sound of chairs scraping, someone dropping a glass, and a wave of terrified noise that broke across the room all at once. The 2 private security men closest to the entrance were neutralized in under 4 seconds. Not killed. These were professionals, not killers, which told Mason something about their objectives when he reviewed it later. Subdued, controlled. It was the work of people who had trained for this exact environment and had a specific target in mind. The target was Amelia. And from the way 2 of the 6 immediately moved toward the dais where she was standing, they knew exactly where she was. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Guests went under tables, toward the walls, toward the fire exits, in every direction at once. Rosa grabbed Sophie's arm and moved immediately toward the pillar nearest their table, putting Stone between the girl and the center of the room. Amelia, on the dais, was calculating. She could see it even from across the room, the way her eyes moved, searching for an exit, a variable, anything. She was not going to find one fast enough. Mason was in the parking lot. He'd left Caleb with Mrs. Fenwick and driven to the hotel anyway, because he had not been able to stop the low, insistent feeling that had been sitting in his chest since Monday morning when Amelia had called. It wasn't logic. It was the part of him that had been built for exactly this. The part that read rooms before entering them, that calculated angles and egress and threat vectors without being asked to, that had kept him alive in places where the margin for error was measured in seconds. He'd been in the parking lot for 40 minutes, sitting in his truck, telling himself he was being paranoid. He heard the alarm from the fire exit at the east side of the building. Not a fire alarm, a panic alarm, the kind that only activates when someone hits the emergency bar from inside under duress. He was out of the truck before the sound fully registered. He came through the service entrance in under 90 seconds. The kitchen was partially cleared. Staff had fled or been moved to the far wall, 2 of them sitting on the floor with their hands on their heads under the watch of a man who was positioned to see the kitchen and the corridor simultaneously. Mason came in low, from the supply corridor on the kitchen's north side, and assessed the room in the 3 seconds it took him to cross to the shelving unit along the east wall. The man watching the kitchen staff was holding a compact weapon and had his back partially to Mason's entry point. He was good. His positioning covered the main entrance and the corridor to the ballroom. He hadn't covered the supply corridor because supply corridors in hotel kitchens are typically locked from the outside. Mason had the key. He'd been maintaining this building for 11 months. He knew where the man's weight was, could read it from the set of his shoulders and the angle of his stance, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who has rehearsed versions of this moment so many times that the execution is less like action and more like memory. It was over in seconds. The kitchen staff stayed on the floor. Mason held up his hands briefly, slow and clear, a gesture he'd learned meant the same thing in every language and every situation. Stay down, I am not the problem. And then he moved through to the ballroom corridor. He stopped at the door, listened, counted voices, counted movement sounds, built the map of the room from audio alone, the way you do it when you've done it 1,000 times and your life depended on getting it right. 4 men visible in the main ballroom, 1 near the east fire exit, 1 near the dais, 2 moving through the crowd, controlling the space. The 6th was the one he'd already dealt with. Amelia was on the dais, not yet restrained. They were moving toward her but hadn't reached her, which meant he had a window. Sophie. He found her by the pillar, Rosa's arm around her, both of them pressed flat against the stone. Sophie was not crying. She was completely still, her face pale, her eyes moving through the room, looking for something. He caught her eye from across the space, and she found him the same moment he found her, and something in her face changed. Not relief, not yet, something more complicated, something that looked like recognition. He put one finger to his lips. She gave one small nod. He moved. What followed was not cinematic in the way people imagine these things. It wasn't choreographed. It was messy and fast and had multiple moments where things could have gone differently in ways that didn't bear thinking about afterward. He used what was available, a tray stand near the east wall, a gap in the crowd's movement pattern, the chandelier's light creating blind spots at certain angles that he'd noticed 11 months ago when he'd been cleaning the fixtures on a lift and had thought, absently, that the lighting setup in this room created poor perimeter visibility. He had not known why he filed that away. He knew now. The man near the exit went down first because he was isolated and because neutralizing him opened the east corridor as an egress option for the civilians near that wall. Mason moved him quietly, efficiently, the way you do it when noise is the enemy. The man near the dais was the problem. He'd reached Amelia by now, had her arm, and was directing her toward the main entrance with the calm urgency of someone who has a vehicle waiting and a timeline. Amelia was not making it easy for him. She was walking slowly, requiring more steering than expected, asking questions in a sharp, clear voice that kept pulling the man's attention to her face rather than the room. She was buying time. She didn't know for what. She couldn't have known Mason was there. But she was doing it anyway, because her instinct under pressure was to resist, to complicate, to make herself as difficult as possible to manage. Mason appreciated that about her, in the cold, focused way that appreciation works when everything else is stripped away. He came from the man's right side, through the crowd's edge, using the movement of panicked guests as cover. 3 seconds of clean sightline. He took it. The room noise changed again as the second man went down. The two in the center of the room responded. Trained response. They turned and consolidated, moving toward each other to present a smaller target and better mutual coverage. They were good. Better than the others. Mason was not out of options. He was in the kitchen corridor again by the time they had turned, and he knew the building, and they did not, and that is a specific and decisive advantage that no amount of training fully compensates for. It took 11 minutes total, from the moment he entered the service entrance to the moment the last of the 6 men was restrained, using zip ties from the kitchen supply room that he'd located by memory in the dark. 11 minutes. He stood in the ballroom with his hands at his sides and his breathing slightly elevated and the sounds of 500 people beginning to surface from wherever fear had taken them. And he felt the specific empty aftermath that always came when the body has been running on a different kind of fuel and the fuel runs out. Not triumph, not anything close to it, just the hollow, ringing silence of what comes after. Then Sophie was there. She'd come from the pillar, Rosa right behind her with her hand out, not fast enough. Sophie crossed the ballroom floor with the focused, purposeful stride that he was beginning to recognize as her particular version of determination, the kind that didn't ask permission. And she stopped in front of him and looked up. "I knew you were here," she said. "You should have stayed behind the pillar," he said. Rosa said that too. She looked at the zip-tied men near the wall without visible distress, the way a child looks at something she's already categorized and filed. Then she looked back at him. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, 8 years old, pale, composed, checking on him. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "A little shaky," she said. "But okay." He nodded. Amelia reached them 30 seconds later. She'd come across the room from the other direction, and when she arrived, she didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at Mason, his hands, his face, the room around him, with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of which she was fully letting out. "How?" she said. "I was in the parking lot," he said. "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because something felt wrong, and I've learned not to argue with that." She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw worked once, the way it did when she was processing something she didn't yet have words for. "Sophie," she said, not looking away from Mason, "go back to Rosa." "Mom, please." The word was different from how she used it in the office or the garden or the conversations with lawyers. Stripped of strategy, just a mother. Sophie went, Amelia and Mason stood in the wreckage of the ballroom while sirens began to sound in the distance, and guests slowly emerged from under tables and against walls and from wherever else the past 11 minutes had put them. You could have been killed, she said. Yes. You went in anyway. Yes. She exhaled, long and unsteady, the sound of someone releasing something that has been held too tightly for too long. Sophie was in there, he said quietly. It was the simplest explanation and also the truest one. Not duty, not training, not instinct exactly. He'd looked through the door and seen his daughter pressed against a pillar in a darkened ballroom, and the rest of it had not been a decision so much as a direction. The way water doesn't decide to run downhill. Amelia heard it. He could tell she heard it. The word he hadn't said, the one that was in his voice underneath the words he had said. She didn't respond to it directly. She wasn't ready for that yet, and he understood, and he didn't push. The police are going to want to talk to you, she said. I know. My lawyers are going to want to talk to you. I know. And She stopped, pressed her lips together. I have things I want to say to you that I don't have the right words for yet. Take your time, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The sirens were close now, pulling into the Hartwell Grand circular drive, the blue and red light beginning to pulse through the tall windows of the ballroom in slow, rhythmic sweeps that crossed the ceiling and the walls and the faces of the people slowly, shakily, coming back to themselves in the room around them. The security footage was released to the press before anyone in Amelia's communications team had the chance to manage it. One of the guests, a venture capital partner who had been under a table near the east wall with his phone pressed to his chest, had been recording, the way people do in crisis when they don't know what else to do with their hands. He'd captured nearly 4 minutes of footage, unsteady and partial, shot from a low angle under the table. It showed Mason moving through the ballroom. It showed the efficiency and the composure and the specificity of what he did and how he did it. It showed, in the last 30 seconds before the man had stopped recording, Sophie walking across the open floor of the ballroom toward Mason, and Mason crouching down to meet her. The footage was on every major platform by midnight. By Saturday morning, it had been viewed 9 million times. The comments used words like guardian and warrior and hero and 100 variations on each, and the tone had the particular breathless quality that the internet reserves for things that seem, briefly, like proof of something it was beginning to stop believing in. The quiet janitor, the hidden soldier, the child who knew. Mason did not watch the footage. He sat in his apartment at 2 in the morning with Caleb asleep in the next room and a cup of coffee that was getting cold, which was apparently just how his nights went now, and he thought about the board members who had filed an inquiry because they'd seen photographs of a man they didn't know talking to a little girl in a garden. He thought about Amelia standing in the ballroom with the sirens coming and something breaking through the surface of her composed face. He thought about Sophie asking him, across the chaos of an evacuating ballroom, "Are you okay?" He picked up the coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway, because wasting it seemed wrong, and because some things you just get through in the state they're in. He thought about garlic, about cold making things stronger. He sat there until the city outside his window began its slow return to morning, and he let the night settle into him the way nights do after the kind of day that rearranges the furniture of who you are. And he did not sleep. But he was not entirely alone either, because Caleb made a sound from the next room, one of those small, random sleep sounds that children make. And Mason turned his head toward it the way you turn toward light, when there's not much of it, and that was enough to carry him through to morning. Outside, somewhere across the city, in a house that was considerably larger and quieter and more defended than his apartment, he suspected that a woman he was still learning to understand was also awake, sitting in her own kind of silence, holding the night and figuring out what to do with everything it had shown her. He thought she'd figure it out. He was beginning to think she could figure out most things, given enough time and enough space to do it on her own terms. He was beginning to think that was something he could work with. The 9 million views became 22 million by Sunday afternoon. Mason knew this because Caleb told him. Caleb had seen the footage on a tablet at Mrs. Fenwick's house. She'd been watching the news coverage and hadn't thought to turn it off before Caleb walked in. And he'd come home with the specific, contained energy of a child who has learned something enormous and is working out how to carry it. He'd sat at the kitchen table while Mason made lunch and said nothing for about 4 minutes, which was unusual enough that Mason set down the knife he'd been using and turned around. Mrs. Fenwick showed you, Mason said. She didn't mean to. Caleb was looking at the table. She felt bad. It's okay. Is that really you? In the video? Mason pulled out the chair across from Caleb and sat down. He didn't try to soften it or reframe it. Caleb was 7, not an infant, and he'd already lost his mother and rebuilt his understanding of the world once. He deserved straight answers. Yes, Mason said. Caleb looked at him. His eyes were Elena's. Bright, quick, the kind that didn't miss much. You said you were in the Navy. I was. You said you fixed things on ships. Mason held his son's gaze. I said I served on ships. That was true. I did other things too. He paused. I should have explained more. I kept it simple because you were younger, and I wasn't sure how to talk about it. That wasn't fair to you. Caleb thought about this with the seriousness he brought to information he was recalibrating around. The people in the video, he said, the bad guys, they're with the police now. Did you hurt them? I stopped them from hurting other people, Mason said. Yes, they got hurt in the process. I tried to keep it to what was necessary. Caleb absorbed this. Sophie was there, he said. Wasn't a question. He'd seen the end of the footage. She was. Another silence. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something with the committed, cyclical energy of a dog who has made barking its entire personality. Were you scared? Caleb asked. I was focused, Mason said. Scared comes after, when it's over and you have time. During, there's no room for it. Is that a Navy thing? It's a training thing. You practice enough that your body knows what to do, and your brain gets out of the way for a while. Caleb nodded slowly. Then he said, Sophie texted me. Mason blinked. When did you two exchange numbers? At the hotel, that day in the lobby. Caleb looked faintly defensive, the way children look when they've done something that wasn't technically prohibited but might be adjacent to the line. She asked. I said, okay. What did she text? She said her mom told her you were okay. She said she wanted me to know. He paused. She said you were brave. Mason looked at his son for a moment. At the careful, complicated expression on his face, pride trying to coexist with the anxiety of someone who has already learned that brave people can still not come home. I came home, Mason said. I know. Caleb's voice was smaller than usual. I know. Mason reached across the table and put his hand on Caleb's arm. He didn't squeeze it or make a production of it, just contact, just I'm here. They sat like that for a while. Then Caleb sniffed once, looked at the counter and said, Are you still making lunch? Yeah. Can we have the grilled cheese? We can have the grilled cheese. Caleb got up and got the cheese from the refrigerator, because he always helped when he could, because that was the kind of boy he was becoming. And Mason stood up and went back to the counter and started making lunch. And outside the dog kept barking, and the world kept being the world. The media spent the better part of the following week trying to find Mason Ryder and learning, with increasing frustration, that he had very little findable surface area. No social media, no public records beyond the standard, driver's license, vehicle registration, apartment lease. The military file was sealed tight in ways that made the journalists who tried to access it eventually give up and write around the absence instead, which produced headlines that were, if anything, more dramatic for what they didn't say. The soldier who disappeared, the hero nobody knew, the man in the janitor's uniform. 3 television networks sent producers to the Hartwell Grand. The hotel management referred all inquiries to Amelia's communications team, which issued a statement that was 18 lines long and said almost nothing with great precision. 2 tabloids published photographs of Mason's apartment building. He'd expected this and had already moved Caleb temporarily to his sister Deb's place in Portland. Deb had driven down the moment she'd seen the news, arriving at 11 at night with a casserole and the no-nonsense energy of an older sibling who has decided to handle something. She'd taken one look at the situation and said, "Pack a bag for him, Mason. I'm taking him back with me until this dies down." And Mason had been too tired to argue and too grateful to pretend he wasn't. He missed Caleb with a specific physical ache, like a missing tooth you keep probing. But he'd called every morning and every night, and Caleb had apparently discovered that Deb's neighborhood had 3 cats that visited the back porch regularly, and he'd named all 3 and was conducting what he described as a research study on their behavior patterns, and he sounded okay. Children adapt. That was either the most reassuring or the most heartbreaking thing about them, depending on the day. Amelia called on Tuesday, mid-morning. The board met again, she said, without calling me. Mason was at the hotel, finishing his shift. He'd kept working because stopping would have looked like retreat, and because the normalcy of the work was something he needed. He stepped into the service corridor with his phone and leaned against the wall. And, he said, Voss is backing down. The footage? Apparently it's difficult to maintain the position that a man is a threat to the Foundation's reputation when 9 million people are calling him a hero. She said it without satisfaction, more like someone reporting a weather change. Drummond abstained from the second session entirely. Chu is still pushing, but he's isolated now. That's good. It's temporary. He'll find another angle. A pause. The investigation into the mercenaries is moving fast. The connection to the competitor company, Veritan Group, is apparently cleaner than anyone expected. My lawyers are saying criminal charges are likely within 30 days. Good, Mason said again. Mason. Her voice shifted. I need to talk to you about something that isn't board politics or mercenaries or legal strategy. He waited. Sophie asked me last night, Amelia said. She sat down at the kitchen table. She does this thing where she picks her moment. She waits until everything is quiet, and then she sits down like she's calling a meeting. And she asked me if you were her father. The corridor was very quiet. What did you say? Mason asked. I said, a pause that was longer than her usual pauses. I said that was a complicated question, and I wasn't ready to answer it yet. Another pause. She said, Mom, I'm not asking complicated. I'm asking yes or no. A breath. She's 8. She's not a typical 8, Mason said. No, she's really not. Amelia's voice did something then, cracked fractionally at the edge, almost imperceptibly, the kind of crack that only appears when a person has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and the grip is finally failing. She told me she already knew. She said she'd known since the gala, not because someone told her, but because she said she just felt it, like something clicking into place. A pause. She said she wasn't angry. She said she just wanted to stop pretending she didn't know. Mason pressed his free hand flat against the concrete wall of the corridor. Cold. Real. What do you need from me? He asked. I need to know if you're ready for this to be real, Amelia said. Not the public part, not the legal part. I mean, the part where she knows, where you sit down with her and she looks at you and it's not a maybe anymore. He thought about Sophie in the garden, talking about cold making things stronger, about her face in the ballroom when she'd crossed the floor to check on him, about the text she'd sent Caleb, she wanted me to know you were okay, which was the act of a child who understood that people who matter to you are connected to each other. I've been ready, he said quietly. I've been waiting for you to be. A long silence. Thursday, Amelia said. Come to the house. We'll do it together. Okay. It's going to be... She stopped, started again. I don't know how it's going to go. Neither do I, he said. That's okay. She hung up. Mason stood in the service corridor for a moment, then went back to work because the floors didn't clean themselves and he had 2 more hours on his shift, and the ordinary demands of life had the useful quality of giving your hands something to do while your mind worked through the larger things. The house was in a quieter part of the city, not the showpiece kind of wealthy, but the old, settled kind. A neighborhood of large trees and wide sidewalks and houses that had been standing for 60 or 70 years. Amelia had bought it 3 years ago, choosing it specifically because it looked nothing like the glass and steel world of her professional life. Sophie had a garden in the back, a real one, not the Foundation's manicured raised beds, but a genuinely unruly patch of dirt and perennials and a tomato plant that had taken over a corner with cheerful aggression. Mason arrived at 6:30 on Thursday evening. He changed out of his work clothes and into something clean and plain, jeans, a dark flannel shirt, because he'd spent 10 minutes staring at his closet and finally landed on the thought that there was no version of this evening that was improved by him being dressed differently than he normally was. Amelia opened the door herself. Rosa was in the background, visible through the hallway, and there were the sounds of a house in the early evening, something in the kitchen, a television somewhere distant that was quickly turned off. She's in the back, Amelia said. She's been out there since she got home from school. She does that when she's thinking something through. Should we go out to her? Mason asked. I'll get her. Amelia paused, looked at him with the direct, unsentimental attention he'd grown to recognize as her version of honesty. You okay? He almost said yes automatically, the way you do when someone asks. Then he stopped and gave it an actual answer. No, he said, but ready. She nodded. Same. She went down the hallway. Mason stood in the entry and looked at the house around him. The photographs on the side table, a child's rain boots by the door, in a color Sophie had apparently chosen herself because they were the orange of a traffic cone and deeply specific. A stack of library books on the entry bench. An umbrella with a pattern of small blue whales. Sophie came in from the back through the kitchen, Amelia behind her, and she was carrying a trowel with dirt still on it, which told Mason she'd been actually working and not just sitting, because Sophie was not the kind of person who sat when her hands could be doing something. She stopped when she saw him, looked at him across the length of the hallway. Then she looked at Amelia. Are we doing it now? She said. Yes, Amelia said. Sophie looked back at Mason. Her expression was the complicated, enormous one he'd seen twice before, in the ballroom and in the garden, the one that was bigger than she had words for yet. She set the trowel down carefully on the entry bench next to the library books. Okay, she said. They sat in the living room, Sophie on the couch, Amelia beside her, Mason in the chair across from them. It was a normal living room, a slightly scuffed coffee table with a water ring on one corner, a throw blanket that had been wadded up and left at one end of the couch, a child's drawing pinned to the wall with the casual permanence of a parent who hangs things up and then can't bring herself to take them down. Sophie, Amelia said, I owe you an honest answer. You asked me one, and you deserved it then, and I'm sorry I didn't give it to you. Sophie was watching her mother with the careful attention of a person who has been waiting for this long enough to have learned patience they shouldn't have had to learn. Mason, Amelia said, is your father. Sophie sat very still. She looked at Mason. He looked back at her. He didn't try to fill the silence or rush it or manage it. He let her have it. How long have you known? Sophie asked him. Since the gala, he said. I found out the same night you did. Did you know about me before that? No, I didn't know you existed until you ran across that ballroom. He held her gaze. I want you to know that. I wasn't somewhere else choosing not to be here. I didn't know. Sophie absorbed this. She was processing it visibly, not hiding it, a sequence of things moving through her face in the way that feelings move through children before they've learned to obscure them. Why didn't you know? She said. Mason glanced at Amelia. Amelia gave him a small nod. Your mom and I met a long time ago, he said. It was one night. I had to leave before morning because of my job, the military job. I didn't have a way to reach her, and she didn't have a way to reach me, and a lot of time went by before we found each other again. That's a long time to not find someone, Sophie said. She wasn't accusing him. She was examining the fact of it. It is, he said. I looked. She looked. The world got in the way. He paused. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix the years, but I need you to know. I would have been here if I'd known you were here. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother. Did you know you were going to find him again? She asked Amelia. Amelia's jaw moved. No, I'd given up hoping. But he came back anyway. I was always in the city, Amelia said. We just didn't know to look for each other there. Sophie considered this with the particular gravity that she brought to large pieces of information. Then she said quietly, I told Caleb. Mason blinked. When? This morning. I texted him. She looked at Mason. I hope that was okay. I thought he should know that we're going to be something to each other. Because he's your son and I'm your daughter. So that makes us siblings, Mason said. Sophie looked at him. Something moved through her face, quick and enormous and gone again before it fully surfaced, the way a wave crests and breaks. He said he knew, she said. He said he figured it out a while ago. He said he was waiting for the adults to catch up. Mason pressed his lips together. He looked at the ceiling for one moment, then back at Sophie. That sounds like him, he said. Sophie's mouth curved. That lopsided, unguarded thing. The real one. It lasted only a second before she reined it back, because she was still in the middle of something serious and she knew it. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, she said. She said it with the precision of a child who has heard adults use that phrase and has decided to use it accurately rather than as a deflection. Because it isn't. I have a lot of feelings about it. That's fair, Mason said. But I don't want to waste time being angry about the part where nobody meant for it to happen, she said. That seems like a waste. He looked at her. This child, 8 years old, sitting on a scuffed-up couch with garden dirt under her fingernails, deciding in real time not to waste herself on anger at circumstances. You're right, he said. It is. So, she said, I want to start from here, if that's okay. It's more than okay, Mason said. She nodded, with the formality of someone completing a negotiation. Then she looked at her mother, then back at Mason and said, in a completely different, smaller voice, Can I call you Dad? Or is that weird yet? The question landed in the room and sat there. Mason's throat did something inconvenient. He pressed through it. It's not weird, he said. Not to me. You call it whatever feels right to you, and if it changes, that's fine too. Sophie thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. Dad, she said, testing the weight of it, seeing how it sat. Then she picked up the wadded throw blanket from the end of the couch, shook it out with the businesslike efficiency of a child completing a task, and pulled it over her lap, as if the word had been said, and now life could continue. Amelia made a sound that she immediately converted into clearing her throat, and looked at the ceiling, and did not say anything for a moment. Mason looked at his hands. The weeks after were not simple, because nothing of any weight is simple. The media attention ground on. A news magazine ran a long feature that got several facts wrong and 2 facts painfully right. The sealed file and the length of time Mason had been working nights to support a child alone. He declined every interview request that came through Amelia's communications team, which was the channel they'd established for filtering contact after the footage went wide. He declined them all with 2 words, delivered through the communications director. No thanks. He was offered money. Multiple times. Television appearances, documentary rights, a book proposal that arrived via his sister in Portland because someone had tracked down her professional email. He declined those too, with slightly more words but the same substance. What he could not decline and did not want to was the particular new gravity of his daily life. He picked Sophie up from school on 2 Wednesdays when Amelia had back-to-back board sessions that ran long. The first time Sophie came through the school's front doors, saw him at the curb, and walked to the car with the elaborate casualness of a child who is working very hard not to look like she's doing something that means a lot to her. She got in, put her backpack on the floor, looked at him, and said, You have to sign in at the office next time. They flagged you. I'll sign in next time, he said. They probably thought you were a stranger. I was, until recently. Well, you're not anymore. She put on her seatbelt with the efficient snap of someone who does not leave seatbelts unclicked. Can we get those potato chips? The kind in the yellow bag. We can get those. Mom says they're terrible for you. They're not great for you, Mason said. You want them anyway? Yes. We're getting them. Sophie looked out the window. He could see the small, private satisfaction on her face. Not about the chips, or not only about the chips. About something larger and quieter than that. They drove to the convenience store and got the chips and ate them in the parking lot because Sophie said they were better before you got home, which he had no argument against. And then he drove her back and Rosa was there for handoff, and it was ordinary. And Mason sat in the car for a moment after Sophie had gone inside and thought about the word ordinary and what it actually meant when you laid it next to what it had cost to get there. Harlan Voss resigned from the board in the 3rd week of November. He issued a statement through his attorney that cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other interests, which was the language of a man who had calculated his position and found it untenable. Patricia Drummond remained chastened. Jeffrey Chu attempted one more line of inquiry, a formal question about the foundation's liability exposure from the ballroom incident, and was informed by Amelia, in writing, that the incident had produced 0 foundation liability and had in fact generated a measurable positive effect on donor engagement that the communications team had tracked down to the percentage. She included the data. Chu did not raise the issue again. The Veritan Group's connection to the mercenary operation produced federal charges against 3 of their executives by the end of November. Amelia's legal team had cooperated fully with the investigation and had provided documentation that, her general counsel described, was cleaner than they deserved, meaning that Amelia had been thorough in ways that now protected her completely. Mason was not surprised by any of this. He'd watched her operate for 3 months, at close enough range to see past the public composure, and he'd formed a clear picture of how she worked. She was not perfect. She was impatient in ways she sometimes didn't catch until they'd already caused friction, and she had a habit of making decisions in isolation and presenting them as finished when they were still negotiable. And there were moments when the gap between the woman who had built something remarkable and the woman who was still figuring out how to be someone's partner, in any sense, was very visible. But she worked on herself. He'd seen that too. She caught her own patterns, named them, adjusted. Not always immediately, but she came back to things. He respected that. The afternoon she offered him the position, head of security and emergency preparedness for the Ashcroft Foundation. She did it in the way she did things when she was trying not to make it a production of itself. She was driving. He was in the passenger seat. They just picked up both kids from a Saturday activity and dropped them at the house, and the car was quiet for the first time in an hour. "I want to offer you a job," she said. I'm not trying to change you into something. I know how that sounds." She kept her eyes on the road. "The foundation needs someone to build a real security infrastructure. After what happened, the board actually agrees with me on something for once. And you know how buildings work. You know threat assessment. You know how to train a team. It's not nothing, Mason. It's a real thing." He looked at the road through the windshield. "What does it pay?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot," he said. "It's market rate. It's about 6 times what I make now." "I know what you make now," she said. Then, catching herself, "That came out wrong. I didn't mean it as, I know what you meant." He thought about it. Not long, but he'd been thinking about it in the oblique way you think about things that are coming before they're offered. "The kids are at the same school now," he said. Sophie had started at Caleb's school 2 weeks ago. Amelia's decision, a restructuring of her daughter's life she'd made slowly and carefully. "My commute from the apartment would be workable. I wasn't suggesting you'd have to move." "I know." He looked at her profile. "I'm going to take it. I want to be clear that I'm not taking it because of anything except that it's the right work and I'm the right person for it." Amelia glanced at him briefly. "I know that. And I'm not taking it because of Sophie or because of you." "Mason, I mean it. I know you mean it. I wouldn't have offered it if I thought you'd take it for the wrong reasons." A pause. "I know who you are." The sentence was plain and short, and she said it like a fact rather than a compliment, which was why it landed the way it did. Not as flattery, but as recognition, which was the rarer and more valuable thing. He looked out the window. They were on the long street that ran toward his apartment, the city in its late afternoon state. The quality of light that made even ordinary buildings look briefly worth seeing. "When do you need an answer?" he said. "You just gave one." "I said I was going to take it. I haven't said yes yet." She looked at him. That expression, complicated and layered and trying to decide whether to be exasperated or amused, landing somewhere between them. "Would you like a moment?" she said. "I would like," he said, "for us to do this correctly, whatever this is." He said it carefully, meaning both the job and the other thing, the larger thing that neither of them had put a name to yet. The thing that had been building in the unguarded moments, in parking lots, in service corridors, in the front seat of a car, with the kids dropped off, and the city going amber around them. Amelia was quiet for a moment. "Correctly," she said, not mocking it, trying it out. "One thing at a time," he said. Their phrase now, the one they'd started using in that coffee shop on Delaney Street, the one that had become shorthand for slowly and deliberately and without pretending we know more than we do. She turned onto his street, pulled up in front of his building, left the engine running. "Yes to the job?" she said. "Yes to the job," he said. "And the other thing." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the particular attention that she reserved for things she'd decided were worth her full concentration. Direct, a little unnerving, and honest in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. The other thing, he said, is going to take some time. I know. And I'm not going to rush it. I'm not asking you to. But I'm not walking away from it either, he said. I want to be clear about that too. Amelia held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the steering wheel, and something in her face settled, not into ease exactly, but into something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been holding her breath and has finally, carefully, let a little of it out. One thing at a time, she said. One thing at a time, he agreed. He got out of the car. She drove away. He stood on the sidewalk outside his apartment building in the October late afternoon light and watched the taillights until they turned the corner and were gone. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from Caleb, from Portland, with a photograph attached. 3 cats on a back porch, each one labeled with a hand-drawn arrow and a name written in Caleb's block printing. Captain. Biscuit. Dr. Fluff. Below the photograph, one line. Dr. Fluff is the boss. Thought you should know. Mason stood on the sidewalk and laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that comes up before you can decide whether it's appropriate. A woman walking her dog gave him a mildly startled look, and he held up a hand in apology, and she moved on, and he was still smiling when he went inside. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, unlocked the door, stepped into the particular quiet of a home without its child in it, and sat down at the kitchen table. He thought about a janitor's uniform folded in the corner of his closet. He thought about a service corridor and a fluorescent light, and a woman who had said, "I believe you like it, cost something." He thought about a girl in a navy dress with a braid coming loose who had crossed 500 feet of ballroom floor on certainty alone. He thought about all the ways a life can get to where it is. The wrong turns and the detours and the things that felt like endings that were actually something else. He got up and made coffee, because the coffee was always going to go cold, and he was always going to make it anyway, and some things about a person don't change, and maybe that was all right. Maybe that was even the point. Caleb came home from Portland on a Saturday morning in early December, and the first thing he did when Mason picked him up from the airport was hand him a crayon drawing that Dr. Fluff had apparently walked across, leaving a single paw print in the corner that Caleb had carefully outlined in black so it would show. "For the refrigerator," Caleb said. "Obviously," Mason said. They drove home with the heat on and the radio low, and Caleb talking without stopping for approximately 45 minutes about the cats, Deb's neighbor, who had a koi pond, a documentary he'd watched about migratory birds, and a dream he'd had involving a submarine that he felt was important to document verbally in full detail. Mason listened to all of it. He'd missed this, the specific, relentless generosity of a child who gives you everything in his head because he trusts you to want it. When they pulled into the apartment complex, Caleb went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is Sophie coming over this week?" "Probably Wednesday," Mason said. "Why?" "I want to show her something." He picked up his backpack from the floor. "I found a book at Aunt Deb's about cephalopods. It's really detailed. She'd like it." Cephalopods. Octopuses, squids, cuttlefish. He said it with the patience of someone who has explained this category before. "Sophie knows a lot about octopuses, but I don't think she knows about cuttlefish. She might surprise you." Caleb considered this. "That would be good too," he said, and got out of the car. Mason sat for a moment after Caleb shut the door, watching his son walk toward the building entrance with his backpack bouncing, already back in the orbit of his regular life as if Portland had been a parenthesis. 7 years old and already so much himself, already so clearly the person he was going to keep being, in all the ways that mattered. Mason thought about the kind of man he wanted Caleb to see when he looked at his father. He'd been thinking about that for 7 years, since the night in a hospital in Virginia, when a nurse had put a small, outraged person in his arms, and Mason had looked at him and understood, with the clarity of something that bypasses thought entirely, that everything he did from that moment forward would be weighted differently than anything he'd done before. He hadn't always gotten it right. There had been nights when the ghosts came and he'd been short with Caleb the next morning without meaning to, and he'd had to sit down later and explain, in simple words, that sometimes adults carry things that make them act smaller than they want to be, and that it wasn't Caleb's fault, ever. There had been months when the money was so tight that Mason had eaten half portions and told Caleb he wasn't hungry, which Caleb had believed because children believe what their parents tell them, with a trust that is both beautiful and terrible in its completeness. There had been moments of real loneliness, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, accumulated kind that builds up in the corners of a life lived mostly in service of someone else. He didn't regret any of it, but he didn't romanticize it either. It had been hard, and hard things leave marks, and the marks were part of him now. The same as the military career and the night in Annapolis, and the 11 months of pushing a mop bucket across marble floors. You are, in the end, the sum of what you survived and what you chose to do with it. He got out of the car and went upstairs to put Dr. Fluff's paw print on the refrigerator. His first week as head of security at the Ashcroft Foundation was not what the job title suggested if you imagined job titles in a certain way. There was no corner office, no team waiting to be commanded, no infrastructure to inherit. What there was a situation assessment that Mason had requested before accepting, a full accounting of the Foundation's current security posture, which turned out to be, in his measured professional opinion, held together with optimism and habit. The ballroom incident had exposed not just a gap, but a fundamental absence of systems, access protocols, vendor vetting, background screening for event staff, emergency response procedures, communication chains. None of it was formalized. None of it was tested. The Foundation had operated on the assumption that its public profile and its existing bodyguard arrangement were sufficient, which was the assumption of an organization that had been lucky rather than careful. Mason wrote his assessment in 11 pages, single-spaced, and delivered it to Amelia on his 4th day. She read it the same evening and called him at 9 at night. "This is thorough," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Some of these recommendations are going to be expensive." "Some of them are. Some of them are just process changes that cost nothing except the discipline to follow them." He'd expected this conversation. "The expensive ones are non-negotiable. The incident cost you more than all of them combined." A pause. He could hear her thinking. "The board is going to push back on the budget line," she said. "I know. I included a cost-benefit analysis in the appendix. Page 9. Another pause. Longer. "You included a cost-benefit analysis," she said. "I've sat in enough planning sessions to know that the argument that wins isn't always the right one. It's the one with numbers behind it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in a voice that was different from her professional one, less assembled, more direct, "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Being more than I expect you to be." She said it plainly, without flattery in it, like a person noting a recurring fact. "I keep setting a bar in my head and you clear it before I finish setting it." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said, "The bar might be off." "I don't think so." A pause. "Page 9 is good, Mason." "I know," he said, and she laughed, a real one, brief and unguarded. And they talked for another 40 minutes about the implementation timeline, and somewhere in the middle of it the conversation stopped being about security infrastructure and became something else, quieter and more careful, two people finding the shape of each other through the medium of an ordinary phone call, which is one of the oldest ways that actually works. December moved through its paces, shorter days, colder mornings, the particular domestic pressure of the holiday season that turns ordinary logistics into something requiring military coordination. Mason navigated it with the same systematic approach he brought to everything, which Caleb found reassuring and Sophie found both admirable and slightly funny. Sophie had started spending Wednesday afternoons and alternate Saturdays at Mason's apartment, an arrangement that had emerged gradually and then formalized itself without anyone making a declaration. The first few visits had the careful, slightly formal quality of people being on their best behavior, and then one Wednesday Caleb and Sophie had gotten into a detailed and surprisingly heated argument about whether a cuttlefish or an octopus would win in a direct competition of intelligence, the terms of which they'd defined themselves and which kept shifting throughout the debate. And after that, the careful quality dissolved and was replaced by something more honest and sustainable. They were not siblings in the way that children who grow up together from the start are siblings. They were siblings in the way that people who choose each other become something, which is its own category, and not lesser for being different. Sophie was organized and precise and had very firm opinions that she expressed clearly. Caleb was lateral and unpredictable, and had very firm opinions that he expressed through a series of tangentially related observations until the point emerged from the surrounding material. They found this mutually baffling and mutually fascinating, which is probably the best foundation for any relationship. Mason watched them from the kitchen one Saturday afternoon, The two of them on the living room floor with a book about ocean ecosystems spread open between them, arguing companionably about something. Sophie was pointing at a page with the authority of someone presenting evidence. Caleb was listening with his chin in his hand and the expression of a lawyer who is letting the other side finish before dismantling the argument. He thought about what it cost. Not money. The other kind of costs, the accumulated weight of every compromise and sacrifice and lonely night and difficult morning that had preceded this Saturday afternoon in a third-floor apartment with children on the floor and the smell of the soup he was making on the stove. He thought about whether it had been worth it, which was a question that answered itself before he finished forming it. The cost and the outcome were the same thing. You don't get the Saturday without the accumulation of everything that came before it, including the hard parts, maybe especially the hard parts. He stirred the soup. Amelia came to the apartment for the first time in the second week of December. She'd brought Sophie for a Saturday visit, and Mason had said, without making it a thing, that there was enough soup if she wanted to stay for lunch, and she'd looked at him and said she'd have to check her schedule, and then checked her phone and said, okay. It was not a momentous occasion. The apartment was the apartment, small, clean in the way of someone who has learned to maintain order because chaos is expensive, with Caleb's drawings on the refrigerator and a bookshelf that was half Mason's military history and half Caleb's animal encyclopedias, and several books that belonged in neither category and had simply accumulated the way books do. A couch that had seen better years. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, which Mason had acquired 2 months ago with no particular stated reason, though they both understood the reason. Amelia sat at the kitchen table while the kids ate in front of the nature documentary Caleb had been promising Sophie for 3 weeks, and she and Mason ate soup and talked. Not about the foundation, not about security protocols, not about board members or legal proceedings, or any of the external architecture of the situation. They talked the way people talk when they're finally willing to be in the same room without an agenda. She told him about her mother, who lived in Connecticut, and called every Sunday and had opinions about everything that Amelia had spent her 20s fighting and her late 20s learning to listen to. He told her about his father, who had died when Mason was 19, 2 months into his first deployment, and who Mason had never fully finished grieving because there had always been something more immediate demanding his attention. "Do you think about what he'd make of all this?" Amelia asked. Mason looked at his soup bowl. Sometimes. He was a quiet man. Didn't require much. Would have liked Caleb a lot. He paused. He would have been embarrassed by the media coverage. He hated that kind of thing. He sounds like you. People keep saying that. He looked up. I think I got the surface of him and missed some of the depth. That's usually how it goes when you lose someone young. You only get part of the picture. Amelia was quiet for a moment. I think about what Sophie is getting of me, she said. The picture she's building. I was very absent for a long time, not physically, but the way you can be present in a room and your mind is somewhere else entirely, running numbers, managing things. She turned her soup spoon over. She never complained. That's the part that got me. She never said a word about it. She just waited. She's patient, Mason said. She shouldn't have had to be. Amelia's voice was level, but it had something underneath it. She's 8. She shouldn't have developed that kind of patience. No, he agreed. He didn't try to soften it. She wasn't looking for softening. I'm changing it, she said. I know I keep saying that. I'm trying to show it rather than say it. I see that, he said. She looked at him. Do you? You're here, he said, on a Saturday, eating soup in a third-floor apartment when you have approximately 17 other things you could be doing. He held her gaze. That's showing it. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly neutral, and then she looked back at her bowl, and there was a quality to the silence that followed that neither of them addressed directly, because they'd agreed, without ever saying so, to be careful with this particular thing, to not rush it, not name it prematurely, not let the weight of everything around it push it into shape before it was ready. But it was there. It had been there for a while, growing in the space between careful people who are learning that the other one is worth the risk. 3 days before Christmas, Amelia called at 7 in the morning. Mason was making Caleb's breakfast and answered with flour on his hands because they'd been attempting pancakes, which was going approximately as well as it always went, which was imperfectly and productively. I want to do Christmas together, she said. No preamble. The 4 of us. At the house. I talked to Sophie and she... Amelia paused. She said, and I'm quoting directly, obviously, Mom, why are you asking me like it's a question? Mason looked at the half-cooked pancake in the pan. Caleb, he said, across the kitchen. Caleb looked up from the stool where he'd been watching the pancake with scientific interest. Amelia wants to know if we want to do Christmas at their house this year. Caleb blinked. With Sophie? With Sophie. A pause of approximately 1 second. Yeah, Caleb said, obviously. Mason put the phone back to his ear. Apparently that's a yes. He could hear the smile in her voice before she spoke. Not the public one, not the composed one. The other one, the one that was newer and less practiced and therefore more real. Good, she said. I'll send you the details. Christmas morning at the Ashcroft house was not the curated, magazine-ready version of the holiday. It was loud and slightly chaotic, and one of the gifts had been wrapped by Caleb in what appeared to be an entire roll of tape, and Sophie knocked a glass of orange juice off the kitchen counter at 7:30 a.m. and said a word that made Amelia close her eyes briefly, and Mason press his lips together and Caleb look at Sophie with new respect. Rosa was there in the morning, then left to be with her own family by noon, which was the arrangement they'd had for 4 years, and which Amelia had restructured slightly this year so Rosa could leave earlier. A small change, unannounced, that Rosa had noticed and commented on with a look that said more than the words. The children tore through the morning with the specific energy of kids who have been waiting for this day for weeks, and are now fully committed to extracting every possible unit of joy from it. They were not precious about the gifts. They liked some things more than others, said so directly, and moved on, which Mason appreciated because he'd never understood the performance of equal enthusiasm for every item. Caleb had gotten Sophie the cephalopod book from Portland. He'd wrapped it himself, with a moderate amount of tape, and written on the tag for Sophie, who probably already knows everything in this, but maybe not. Sophie had opened it, flipped to the cuttlefish chapter, read half a page and said, I didn't know this part, with genuine satisfaction, which made Caleb look like he'd won something significant. Sophie had gotten Caleb a small mounted specimen, a starfish properly preserved and labeled, from a science supply store she'd found online and ordered herself, because she had a specific allowance and opinions about how to use it. Caleb held it with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred object and said, This is the best gift I've ever gotten, which was possibly an exaggeration and also possibly not. Mason had gotten Amelia a book, a first edition of something he'd noticed she mentioned once, in passing, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, a detail he'd filed away without deciding to, which she understood when she unwrapped it because she looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of someone encountering evidence of being known. You remembered that, she said. I remember most things, he said. She held the book for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the side table, in the particular way of someone putting something in a place where it won't get lost. She had gotten him a watch, not expensive in the showy sense, but well made, simple face, leather band, the kind of watch that does one thing and does it correctly. She'd had the back engraved. He turned it over and read it standing in her living room on Christmas morning with the children making noise in the background and the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen. It said, Still here, still counting. He looked at her. The night counts, she said. Quiet, just for him. In Annapolis, the years we didn't know. All of it counts. I didn't want you to think I'd... She stopped, reorganized. I didn't want you to think I was only counting forward. He turned the watch over in his hands. It was the kind of sentence, still here, still counting, that could mean several things at once, and all of them were true, and she'd understood that when she'd chosen it, which was the kind of understanding that is not learned quickly. Thank you, he said, and meant it in several directions simultaneously. He put it on. It fit. January arrived with the cold and the administrative rhythm of new beginnings, and Mason stepped fully into the security role with the methodical commitment he brought to anything he decided was worth doing correctly. He hired 3 people in the first month, vetted carefully, trained deliberately, integrated slowly. He built the protocols from the foundation up, documented everything, tested the systems before relying on them. It was the same approach he'd used in the Navy, adapted for a different environment, but rooted in the same principle. You build the structure before you need it, because the moment you need it is too late to start building. The board, reconfigured after Voss's departure and Chu's diminishment, had voted unanimously to approve the security budget in early January. Patricia Drummond, who had abstained from the worst of the governance inquiry and had been watching since, came to Mason's office, a small one on the building's third floor, functional rather than impressive, on his second week and sat down without being asked. "I want to apologize," she said, "for my role in what happened last fall." Mason looked at her. She was 61, a former corporate attorney, and she had the manner of someone who chooses words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. This sentence had been chosen deliberately. "I wasn't one of the architects of it," she said, "but I didn't stop it when I could have. That's a distinction without much moral difference." "Why are you telling me?" he asked. "Because I'd like to start over," she said, "and starting over requires acknowledging what you're starting over from." He studied her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it?" "You said what you needed to say. I heard it." He paused. "Now we work." She looked at him for a moment with something that might have been relief, or might have been the recalibration of someone who expected a harder response and is adjusting to the reality of a simpler one. "Yes," she said. "We work." She left. Mason went back to the security protocol document he'd been reviewing. He had learned over the years that forgiveness is not a door that opens once and stays open. It's a practice, a daily decision, a choice you make in the ordinary moments rather than the dramatic ones. The dramatic moments get the credit, but it's the ordinary ones, the willingness to sit across a table from someone and move forward, the willingness to stop carrying what isn't useful to carry anymore, that actually constitute the thing. He'd had to learn this slowly, the way most things worth knowing are learned. Through the loss of his father before he'd made his peace with him, through the loss of Elena, who had been his partner for 2 years, and Caleb's mother and a person he'd loved imperfectly, and who had died of something fast and cruel and random, the kind of thing that does not allow for narrative justice. Through the years of carrying the weight of that mission, the one that had ended his career, the one where he'd made the right call and paid for it with everything, without having anyone to put it down in front of. He'd been carrying things alone for so long that the unfamiliar weight of not carrying them alone required its own adjustment. The evening that changed the shape of things finally, not dramatically, not with music, but in the quiet way that real changes tend to happen, was in late February. The children were asleep. It happened at the Ashcroft house, which had become the more natural gathering point over the months, partly for practical reasons, and partly because it was larger, and partly because Sophie's unruly back garden had become a place all four of them used in different ways. Mason and Amelia were in the kitchen. He'd cooked. He cooked when he was there in the evenings, not because it was assigned, but because it was something he did, and she didn't. And practical divisions of labor are a form of intimacy that doesn't get enough credit. She'd been reviewing documents at the kitchen table while he cooked, and they'd talked intermittently about the Foundation's spring initiative, about Caleb's recent obsession with tide pools, about a conversation Sophie had apparently had with her school counselor that was positive enough that Amelia had come home from the meeting looking lighter than she had in weeks. The dinner was cleared. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city was doing its late winter thing, cold without being brutal, the particular stillness of a February night when most people have gone inside. Amelia poured 2 glasses of wine and set one in front of Mason and kept one for herself and leaned against the counter across from him. And for a while, neither of them said anything, because they'd gotten comfortable enough with each other's silence that they no longer felt compelled to fill it. Then she said, "I keep waiting for it to feel complicated." He looked at her. "What?" "This." She gestured slightly. "At the kitchen, the house, the general arrangement of things. All of it. I keep waiting for the part where it gets too hard or too strange or where I realize I've miscalculated something. Because that's usually what happens. That's been my experience." She turned her wine glass slowly. "But it's not happening." "Maybe you calculated correctly this time," he said. "I didn't calculate," she said. "That's the thing. I didn't strategize this. I didn't manage it into existence." She looked at him. "I just let it happen, which is not something I'm good at." "You're better at it than you think," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The particular look, direct, undefended, the one she reserved for things she'd decided to be honest about. "I want to stop living separate lives," she said. I've been thinking about how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm pushing, and I can't find one, so I'm just saying it. She paused. Not tomorrow. Not immediately. I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I'm asking you to know that it's where I'm pointing. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I've known for a while. You didn't say anything. Neither did you, until now. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered by a very patient person and cannot entirely object to it. So? She said. So, he said. Is that a yes? He thought about yes, about what it meant. Not the word, but the weight behind it. The yes to this kitchen and this house and these two children asleep down the hall. The yes to the complicated, imperfect, ongoing work of building something with another person who is also complicated and imperfect, and who has her own history and her own marks and her own ways of being that would require continuous learning. The yes to being seen, which was not the same as being known from a distance, which was harder and more necessary. He thought about a ballroom and a child who crossed it on certainty alone. He thought about garlic in winter soil. He thought about a watch with an engraving on the back. Still here, still counting. Yes, he said. Amelia let out a breath, slow and real, the kind that carries something with it. She didn't move toward him dramatically. She pushed off the counter and closed the distance between them and put her arms around him the way people do when they've been waiting a long time to do something simple and are finally doing it, which is the best kind of doing something. Not the first time, but the right time, which are not always the same moment, and this one happened to be both. He put his arms around her and they stood in the kitchen in the late winter quiet and did not say anything for a while because some things don't need language and in fact are diminished by it. In the morning, Sophie came downstairs before anyone else and found Mason making coffee and did not register any surprise whatsoever, which told him she had understood the direction of things before any adult had said a word, because Sophie always did. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and put her chin in her hands and watched him for a moment. Are you staying? She asked. Matter of fact. We're working on it, he said. She nodded. Good. She looked at the coffee maker. Can I have hot chocolate? Yes. The real kind, not the powder. I know the kind you like, he said. She smiled. The lopsided one, the unguarded one, the real one, that came before she could decide whether to offer it. I know, she said. Caleb was told on a Sunday afternoon sitting at the kitchen table in Mason's apartment because Mason believed that his son deserved the information in his own space, where he had the most ground under his feet. Mason explained it carefully, not with excessive gravity, not minimizing it either. The plan, the direction of things, what it would mean in practical terms, and what it wouldn't change. Caleb listened. He had his chin in his hand in the way he did when he was actually processing rather than waiting to respond. When Mason finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. So we'd all be in the same house, he said. Eventually, yes. We're taking it step by step. Sophie and me would be like, for real siblings. Yes. Caleb considered this. He looked at the table, at some invisible point where he appeared to be working through the implications. He was 7, and 7 is old enough to understand that change has dimensions, that some things you gain and some things you change the shape of, and that both of these can be true at the same time. She still argues wrong about octopuses, he said. Probably always will, Mason said. I can live with that. He looked up. Is this what you want, Dad? Like, actually? Mason looked at his son. The question, the specific quality of it, the way it centered Mason's want rather than the practical logic of the situation, was one of the clearest things Caleb had ever said, and he'd said a lot of clear things. Yes, Mason said. This is actually what I want. Caleb nodded, slowly, with the weight of a decision being made. Okay then, he said. Okay. There is a thing that happens when you have been alone in a particular way for long enough, where you stop noticing the shape of the absence. It becomes the furniture of your life. You arrange everything around it without thinking about it, the way you arrange furniture around a weight-bearing wall, building your whole interior around the fact of the gap. Mason had done this. He'd been a good father and a capable man, and he'd built a life that worked, and he had not let himself understand how much of it was arranged around the shape of what wasn't there. He understood it now, in the way you understand something only after it changes. The before and the after are the only lens. The four of them settled into a life that was not seamless, because lives aren't, and families aren't, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not lived in one. Sophie had bad weeks, carried sometimes by the accumulated weight of the years she'd spent being patient and perfect and undemanding, and those weeks required a particular kind of steadiness from the adults around her. Caleb had nights where the Elena-shaped absence in him made itself known in ways he couldn't articulate and didn't need to. And Mason sat on the edge of his bed those nights and did not try to explain or resolve it, just stayed. Amelia and Mason disagreed, sometimes sharply, about things that ranged from foundation decisions to the question of bedtimes to the larger, wordless territories of two people learning to share space and priority and emotional real estate. They were not always graceful about it. There were evenings where one of them said something in a tone that the other one filed and returned to later, when the filing felt less useful. There were mornings after those evenings that required the particular effort of people who have chosen each other across a distance and are committed to keeping choosing. But they did it. They showed up and did it, imperfectly and persistently, which is the only way it actually works. The security division of the Ashcroft Foundation became, over the following year, something Mason was genuinely proud of. Not in the way of someone who needs recognition, but in the quiet, internal way of someone who has done a thing correctly and knows it. He built a team that was competent and trained and trusted each other, which was the hardest and most important part. He built systems that were tested before they were needed. He built, slowly, an organization that could protect itself, which was the only kind that actually could. Amelia restructured her schedule in ways that were visible and irreversible. She left meetings. She answered Sophie's calls. She ate dinner at the table more nights than not, even when the foundation was in a complicated phase, even when the email count was climbing, even when the professional version of her life was pulling in its familiar, urgent direction. She did not always succeed, but she tried in ways she hadn't tried before, and trying differently is its own kind of courage. Sophie grew. Turned 9, then 10. Her braids stayed perpetually coming undone, a fact she eventually decided to stop fighting, wearing her hair loose instead with the equanimity of someone who has identified where their energy is better spent. She was at 10, already the person she was always going to be in outline. Perceptive, precise, generous in specific and deliberate ways, stubborn in ways she'd inherited from both parents simultaneously, and wore without apparent irony. She called Mason dad without ceremony, because that was what he was. And she called Caleb her brother because that was what he was. And she had the quality of someone who decided things and then lived in the decision without looking back. Caleb, at 9, published, through his school's science blog, which was a modest platform that nonetheless thrilled him, a 2,000-word piece on cuttlefish cognition that Sophie had read 3 times and annotated in pencil in the margins, which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. He kept naming stray cats in every neighborhood they visited. He carried Dr. Fluff's paw print in a frame that had migrated from the apartment refrigerator to the room in the new house, where it occupied the place of honor it had always deserved. The evening Amelia had described in February, the stopping of separate lives, happened gradually, the way all real things happen, assembled piece by piece in the ordinary moments rather than inaugurated in one. There was a night in spring when Mason came home after a late foundation meeting and the house was quiet, and he walked through it in the dark the way you walk through a house that is yours, not being careful, not a guest, just moving through familiar space. And he stopped in the hallway and stood there for a moment and understood, without needing to mark it or say it out loud, that this was home. Not the building. The building was fine. The building had the orange rain boots by the door, and Caleb's drawings on the hallway wall, and the tomato plant in the back garden, making its annual territorial claim on the corner, and all of that was real and mattered. But home was the people inside it, asleep, trusting the house to hold them, and trusting him to be part of what held it. He stood in the hallway in the dark for a while. He thought about the night in the service corridor, the buzzing fluorescent light, a number, 8, that had rearranged his understanding of his own life. He thought about pushing a mop bucket along a marble floor and watching a girl in a navy dress go still, and the specific, enormous clarity of a child who trusts what she knows before the adults around her have finished deciding whether it's true. He thought about what it means to protect something, not in the military sense, the tactical sense, the sensor and response sense, but in the deeper, slower sense. To show up every day for a life that depends on you showing up. To be the person who stays, not dramatically, not heroically, just stubbornly, day after day, because the people you love need a person who stays. That, in the end, was the thing. Not the Navy record, or the ballroom, or the security footage that had made him briefly famous, and then faded, as these things do, into the background of a world with a very short memory. Not the title, or the salary, or the board's eventual grudging respect. The thing was this hallway, these sleeping people, this ordinary, irreplaceable, hard-won night. He went to bed. In the morning, Caleb would come downstairs with new information about a species Mason hadn't heard of. Sophie would arrive at the breakfast table with a book already open and an argument already formed about something. Amelia would have her phone in her hand and then put it face down on the counter because she was working on that. She was genuinely working on it. There would be spilled orange juice, and someone would forget their lunch, and the morning would run late, and someone would have to drive faster than was strictly recommended. It would be imperfect and real and entirely, completely his. That was enough. That had always been the thing he was working toward, even when he didn't know it. Not the extraordinary moments, but the right to have ordinary ones. The tomato plant in the back garden came up again in spring, the same as always, claiming its corner with the cheerful persistence of something that has simply decided to keep growing. Sophie found it one morning and announced it with the satisfaction of a person greeting an old friend. Caleb took notes. Mason drank his coffee on the back steps and watched the two of them crouch over the plant in the early light, heads bent together, already arguing about something. Amelia came out behind him and leaned against the doorframe with her own coffee and looked at the children. "Still here," she said. He looked at her. "Still counting," he said. She bumped her shoulder against his lightly, the way people do when words are adjacent to the thing, but the body says it more accurately, and they stood there in the early spring morning while the children argued about tomatoes, and the city woke up around them, and the day began.